Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Carsey Policy Hour, and thank you for joining us. I'm Melinda Negron-Gonzalez, and I'm delighted to be your new host. I'm an associate professor of political science and the grad programs coordinator at the Carsey School of Public Policy. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to give a heartfelt thank you to the former host, UC Terrell, who did an outstanding job leading this series. UC's thoughtful introductions and steady guidance helped make the Carsey Policy Hour a trusted space for dialogue and insight. Thank you, UC. For those joining us for the first time, the Carsey Policy Hour is a monthly conversation series hosted by the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. Each month, we bring together policymakers, practitioners, and community members to explore the issues shaping New Hampshire and beyond. Today's session is titled New Hampshire Demographic Trends, What It Means for You. I should mention that the Carsey School is independent and nonpartisan. The school is nationally recognized for rigorous and actionable research, housing 4 research centers, and the Carsey School educates tomorrow's leaders through its professional master's programs offered both online and in person. Do check out our website for more info on Carsey research centers and graduate programs. Our series partners for the Carsey Policy Hour are the New Hampshire Municipal Association, New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training, the New England Sustainability Network, and the New Hampshire Association of Counties. And we welcome all of you. Please do feel free to enter in your name and affiliation in the chat. The chat is on your upper left-hand corner in Teams if you're unfamiliar with Teams. So as I mentioned, today's session is titled New Hampshire Demographic Trends, What It Means for You. And we're privileged to welcome Dr. Kenneth Johnson, Senior Demographer at the Carsey School and Professor of Sociology at UNH. Dr. Johnson is a nationally recognized authority on demographic change. You may have seen him on CNN or some other news program, and he focuses on topics such as population redistribution, rural and urban dynamics, and the growing diversity of our society. Dr. Johnson has authored a book and over 300 articles and papers, and among other things, he is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. In this presentation, Ken will walk us through the latest Census Bureau data on New Hampshire's demographic shifts, from migration patterns to age structure and from geographic variation within the state to the implications of changing racial and generational diversity. This session promises to offer both clarity and context for the decision-making ahead. So I encourage you to think about what the data means for your communities, whether you're involved in local service delivery, civic planning, advocacy, or just simply care deeply about New Hampshire's future. Feel free to submit comments and questions during the presentation using the chat feature. You'll find the chat button, as I mentioned, on the center left of your team screen. And the chat is open and visible to everyone as if we're sitting in the same room together having a discussion over coffee this morning. I do ask, in the spirit of civil discussion, please avoid inflammatory remarks and do identify yourself in the chat when you offer remarks or pose questions. Thank you. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kenneth Johnson as he unveils the latest trends in New Hampshire's population landscape.
Thank you, Melinda. I'd like to acknowledge some of the people who helped me in my research, my graduate students and former graduate students. And I'd also like to acknowledge the groups who have funded my research. So you can see them listed here. But of course, all the opinions, all the things I say are my opinions. They don't reflect the institution's opinions or findings. So New Hampshire population growth patterns have diminished in recent decades, but in the most recent period, particularly since 2020, they've accelerated. So we have this combination of a long-term slowing of New Hampshire's population gains, but in the short term, the population growth rate has increased. New Hampshire's always been one of the fastest growing states in New England. You can see here that in every decade, New England or New Hampshire is either the fastest growing or the second fastest growing state. But I would remind you that New England is one of the slowest growing parts of the United States. So in a sense, New Hampshire is winning the race among the turtles, if you will, the slow growing places. This shows you at the county level more patterns of growth and decline in New York State and in New England. And you can see that New Hampshire has widespread growth since the 2020 census. And only one county, Coos, has actually lost population in comparison to other parts of the region where you see widespread population loss. Now, I don't want to give you a Demography 101 lecture, but you should appreciate, and this is important to what we're going to talk about, that there are different ways that the population can change. On the one hand, we have what we call natural change, which is the difference between the number of births and deaths, and that's very important in New Hampshire. And then we have migration, usually calculated as net migration, which is the difference between the number of people moving into New Hampshire and the number of people leaving. And in some of my parts of my presentation, I'll break that down further into domestic migration, which is people coming from one place in the United States to New Hampshire, and international migration, which are people coming directly from another country to New Hampshire. So you can see this is New England demographic change between 2020 and 2024. You can see that in all the states except Connecticut and Massachusetts, more people died than were born. Now, partially this is a function of COVID, but it also is a function of long-term demographic trends. So a state like New Hampshire depends particularly on migration for its growth. Most of New Hampshire's migration is domestic, that is coming from other places in the United States, but it also does have some immigration as well. And these together have offset population loss caused by more deaths than births. You can contrast it with Massachusetts, which depends very heavily on immigration to fuel its population growth recently. It experienced domestic outmigration, some of it to New Hampshire, and it did also have a little bit of natural increase. These are the long-term trends for New Hampshire. You can see the important role that migration plays in New Hampshire's population growth down through the last several decades. In each of those decades, except between 2000 and 2010, it was migration that fueled most of New Hampshire's gain. And then in the most recent period, all of the growth in New Hampshire is a function of migration. This is a more close-up of the more recent periods. The Great Recession had a big impact on demographic change, both in New Hampshire and elsewhere in the United States, essentially slowing migration. More people stayed put, fewer people moved. And you can see that reflected in New Hampshire's demographic trends. And especially then in the most recent period, you can see the important role that domestic migration to New Hampshire plays, and also the contribution of immigration, offsetting that excess of deaths over births. Now, the story of demographic change in New Hampshire is driven partially by what we call natural change. And you can see in this series of graphs how New Hampshire's natural change has shifted over time. Early between 2000 and 2017, there were more births than deaths in New Hampshire every year. The number of deaths slowly increased as the population aged. And finally, in 2017, more people died in New Hampshire than were born for the first time. And that trend has continued. Of course, COVID exacerbated it, but it's important to recognize that even before COVID, more people were dying in New Hampshire than being born. Partially that's because of the fertility patterns in New Hampshire. The number of women of childbearing age has diminished slightly in New Hampshire. And you can see on that graph in the lower left-hand corner, the number of births has diminished as well, and so is the fertility rate. So New Hampshire has one of the lowest fertility rates in the United States. That is, the number of children born to women in their childbearing years is lower in New Hampshire than elsewhere in the United States. So partially, the slowdown in births in New Hampshire is a function of a decline in the fertility rate, and these fertility rate declines are occurring almost all over the United States. Another reason for the decline in the number of births is that there were fewer women of childbearing age in New Hampshire. On the other side, deaths, New Hampshire has a rapidly aging older population. Of course, older populations are at greater risk of mortality. And so you can see the sharp rise in New Hampshire's older population. It's nearly doubled since 2000. It's going to continue to grow. So the number of deaths is rising because of that, not because the death rates are higher, although they did go up slightly during COVID. So it's not that the death rates are rising in New Hampshire. The reason for the significant increase in the number of deaths, aside from COVID, is that there's an increasingly older population in New Hampshire. So here we have one side of the demographic situation. This is natural change. New Hampshire has had more people die in it than be born recently, and is likely to continue to experience that in the future. Other states nearby, like Maine and Vermont, also have more deaths than births. So this means that New Hampshire's demographic change depends heavily on migration. Now, this graph is fairly complicated, but it's one of the most important graphs that you're going to see today because it emphasizes several points. First, you can see that the number of births in New Hampshire, about 60,000 between 2019 and 2023, is not as many as the number of deaths, the 69,000 deaths. So that's the natural loss. But the other key point I want you to see is New Hampshire had a net domestic migration change of 33,000, a modest number, enough to offset natural increase and natural decline. But the key point I want you to see is how many people moved into and out of New Hampshire to produce that modest gain, because this is a key point about New Hampshire's population. New Hampshire's population is much more a function of migration and of turnover in its population than in many other states. So you can see to produce that 33,000 person gain over those 5 years, 263,000 people moved into New Hampshire and 230,000 left. Remember, the population of New Hampshire is only 1.4 million. So that's a huge turnover in the population. So when you think about policy or social issues in New Hampshire, recognize that the people who are here now, many of them were not here 5 years ago. You can also see immigration, which also contributed to New Hampshire's population gain. Again, New Hampshire has a relatively modest number of immigrants, but you can see that they contributed to the change as well. So New Hampshire's population in this period grew by 35,000, okay, a modest gain. But that's because there were 337,000 people who moved into New Hampshire or were born here. And there were 302,000 people who left New Hampshire or died here. So 33,000 person growth of the population is a function of an enormous amount of turnover in the population. So New Hampshire has one of the most mobile populations in the United States. Only 42% of the people who live in New Hampshire were born here. Now, New Hampshire benefits from migration. And another key point that I made, but I want to show you one more time, is notice how New Hampshire differs from both, even New England, but certainly from the United States. A much smaller proportion of its population was born in the state. A much larger proportion of its population was born somewhere else in the United States, but it has relatively little immigration. So this makes it different even than the rest of New England and certainly than the United States, where a much larger proportion, almost 60% of the people in the United States live in the state they were born in. In New Hampshire, it's only 40%. This is where domestic migrants come from and go to. So the pie chart on the left shows you where people come to New Hampshire from. And you'll notice Massachusetts is a substantial source of migrants. About a quarter of the population in New Hampshire was actually born in Massachusetts. In contrast, if you look at where people leave New Hampshire to go, Massachusetts is still a significant destination, as are Maine and Vermont, but there's also a big flow to the south. Now, partially this is a flow of older retirees leaving New Hampshire, but also of other people moving to all the economic activity and growth that's going on in the south. So again, key point that I want you to come away from this talk with is that there's a lot of change in the population of New Hampshire. It's not all the people who've been here forever. Now, New Hampshire benefits from migration on a number of fronts. Now, migration to New Hampshire was particularly pronounced during COVID. And here you can see not the flow of people, but the flow of revenue or income to and from New Hampshire. So Massachusetts, the biggest source of migrants to New Hampshire, the migrants moving to New Hampshire from Massachusetts between 20 and 22, according to IRS data, their total earnings was about $1.4 billion annually. The people who left New Hampshire to move elsewhere, particularly to Massachusetts, their earnings were about $500 million. So New Hampshire had a net gain of almost $1 billion in income a year from migration exchanges with Massachusetts. You can see similar patterns for the Northeast, although much less pronounced. In the exchange of migrants with the South, New Hampshire loses income, partially because, again, some of these are older migrants who have substantial income and are leaving New Hampshire to go elsewhere. But again, so my main point is migration, which is important to New Hampshire, is an economic gain to the state. This is education. New Hampshire also gains education from the residents who migrate to the state. Many more of a significantly larger share of the migrants to New Hampshire are better educated. And in this graph, you can see, look at the college graduates, for example, the proportion of the group migrating to New Hampshire from elsewhere in the United States has a higher average education level than New Hampshire residents. So did the foreign-born population moving to New Hampshire. And you can see that same pattern among those with graduate degrees. So again, remember, in this data, about 325,000 of these people are New Hampshire born. About 600,000 are migrants from other U.S. destinations. Only 75,000 are foreign born. Among the population in New Hampshire over the age of 25, only a third of that population, of the over 25 population in New Hampshire, was born in the state. So migration is a big force, and it brings income to New Hampshire. It brings education to New Hampshire. This is age-specific net migration. The amount of work that went into generating these data is enormous. I was on the teams that helped generate these estimates. The key point to you, though, is that in the migration exchanges between New Hampshire and other places, New Hampshire gains people in their 30s and 40s, and it also gains children, because, of course, those children would come with the parents. New Hampshire, in some decades, has lost young adults. In the 2010 to 2020 decade, it actually sort of hold its own on people 20 to 29. You can see how small the red bar is. And New Hampshire also has a modest influx of older adults, not huge, but modest. So most of the people moving to New Hampshire are what you might call family age. They're either in their 30s and 40s or their children. So again, in a state like New Hampshire, who have a large older population, an influx of family age population and children is a benefit to the state. For example, more children begin the first grade in New Hampshire each year than were born in the state 6 years earlier. In other words, the flow of people into New Hampshire brings children with them. This is the most recent data on migration. It's not quite as good as the data that you saw in the previous slide, but it does show you that in the most recent periods, the patterns have been similar with an influx of working age, people in their 30s and 40s, and children. Also, New Hampshire did a better job of retaining its 18 to 29-year-olds during this period. Now, those are sweeping demographic changes in the country, in the state as a whole. Even in a modest-sized state like New Hampshire, there's quite a bit of variability in demographic change within the state, and I want to show you that a little bit here. This is the annual population change in New Hampshire for counties between 2010 and 2020, and then during the COVID era. And you can see that almost all of the New Hampshire counties grew during both of those periods. Whether they grew faster during the COVID period or during the earlier period varies. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I just wanted to show you that population gains were widespread. Only Coos County had a population loss in either of those periods. This shows you how migration change occurred in these counties. That is, how much of it, the orange bar, was due to natural change. And you can see in all the counties except Hillsborough, more people died than were born in New Hampshire between 20 and 24. So only Hillsborough had a modest excess of births over deaths. So all the population change in all the New Hampshire counties except Hillsborough was due to migration. So again, this underscores how important migration is to New Hampshire. I want to show you 4 specific counties that illustrate some of the variability in how growth occurs and also reflect patterns elsewhere in the United States. So on the left, you have Carroll County. Carroll's a recreational county, lots of beautiful scenery, lakes, and things in it. And it's like other recreational counties. There are about 300 of these recreational counties in the United States. Carroll County was the fastest growing county in the state in both the 2010 to 2020 period and in the most recent period. And you can see that all of that growth, all of it, was fueled by migration. So a lot of amenity migrants are coming to Carroll from other places in the United States, attracted by the lakes and the scenery and the mountains. And again, this is what's happened in other parts of the United States as well. In contrast, you have Rockingham County, Rockingham County is considered part of the Boston metropolitan area by the Census Bureau. It's on the outer edge of the area. It's receiving much of the outward sprawl out of the Boston metropolitan area. It's reflective of other kinds of counties like this around big metropolitan areas. And you can see that during the 2010 to 2020 period, Rockingham had both migration gain and it had natural increase to fuel its population change. It had a very modest natural loss between 2020 and 24, and a lot of migration gain. Hillsborough, of course, where Manchester and Nashua are, is like many medium-sized metropolitan areas in the United States, depending both on natural increase and on migration to fuel their growth. And you can see that in both periods, it was migration that fueled most of its growth, but it did have natural change as well. Finally, Coos County, the most northern county in the state, has lost population both between 2010 and 2020 and in the most recent period. Most of the loss occurs because more people are dying in the county than are being born. Migration gains offset that partially, but not entirely. And so here within the state, you see 4 different profiles of growth. You see a recreational county with all of its growth fueled by a substantial influx of migrants. You see a suburban county growing mostly through migration, but also with some natural change. You see a middle-sized urban area growing mostly by migration, but also by population gain. And then you have a remote rural county that is declining because of population loss. Although note that the migration gains to Coos County during the most recent period are nearly large enough to offset that population loss. And a part of that is amenity migration, similar to what Carroll County has received. And again, these counties look very much like similar kinds of counties elsewhere in the country. Just to let you see a more detailed pattern of population change, here you can see demographic change at a much more micro level. And you can see during both periods, widespread growth in the southern, especially the southeastern part of the state, and more modest growth or loss in the north. New Hampshire, I mean, everybody hears about how New Hampshire is aging, and that, in fact, certainly is another major demographic issue for the state. Here's the population change for different age groups between 2010 and 2020, and from 2020 to 24. And the dominant theme in this is the large increase in the older population, which you can see, these are largely baby boomers who are aging into old age. New Hampshire has one of the largest proportion of its population in the baby boom generation of any state, partially because people moved to New Hampshire, many of them when they were younger, and now are aging in place. In contrast, you can see among the child population that the child population is diminishing through time. So sort of a dominant demographic pattern in New Hampshire is this aging of the population. These are population pyramids, which demographers use to look at how the age structure changes. The one on the left shows you the age structure of New Hampshire in 1990, with men in blue and women in red. And I indicated 3 generations, if you will, to show you how change occurred. So notice the people in their 30s and early 30s in 1990, that's the heart of the baby boom, who at that time were in their 30s. Behind them, you notice the other pink cohort or light blue cohort, the 1976 to 80 group. Those are the children of the baby boom, if you will. And the baby boom had fewer children than itself, and it had them later. And so that notch that you see where there are fewer people, 76 to 80, is a reflection of that. If you saw that pyramid for elsewhere in the United States, it would be similar. And then the babies that were born, just born, the 0 to 4-year-olds in 1990, is that last cohort who you can see as children. Now, if you look at the right pyramid, there's the same group. That's New Hampshire's population 30 years later in 2020. And you can see the shift in the distribution of the population with the baby boom shifting up into the older age group. So here's change in the demographic population. You can see literally the aging of New Hampshire's population in these graphs. This is the most recent data on age structure in New Hampshire. And I wanted to highlight to you if you look on the right-hand side, the 60 to 69-year-olds, that's the heart of the baby boom. There are 213,000 of them right now. Just older than them are the 70 to 79-year-olds who represent the front edge of the baby boom, about 138,000 of them. Now, some of that 213,000, unfortunately, will be lost to mortality in the next few years. But you can see that cohort is bigger than the cohort ahead of it. And so as that cohort ages up, you're going to have even a larger concentration of older adults. And the cohort right behind it, that's currently 50 to 59, 187,000, is still a substantial size cohort, especially compared to the cohorts behind it. So the aging that we're seeing in New Hampshire is going to continue. The age distribution of the population is also relevant. You can see that on the left-hand side is the percentage of the population in a different age group. So these are young people. So the areas that are red and orange are places where there are larger proportions of younger adults. The blues and greens are places where there are smaller percentages of young people. And then the dot matrix map on the right is showing you where the actual people are. So each dot represents 5 people. So you can see that although the young population is more concentrated in the South, so is the number of people who are young. So this has implications for school districts, for example, who have to make sure they have enough school capacity to handle these large populations of young people. This is the working age population. You can see the distribution again with larger concentrations of working age people in the South, particularly in the Southeast. And also on the right-hand graph, you can see that's where most of the working age population is too. So both proportionally and numerically, that population is concentrated in the South. This is the older population, and you'll notice fairly distinct differences in the distribution of what proportion of the population is older, with the northern part of the state having substantially large proportions of older adults compared, say, to the Hillsborough, Rockingham, Stratford County area. But more of the older adults are in the South, just because a larger proportion of the population is concentrated in the southern county. So again, this shows some of the diversity of New Hampshire, that its age distribution is uneven. The state is aging, but it's aging differentially in different parts of the state, which are going to produce challenges for agencies and institutions that deal with age-based populations. You hear a lot about how New Hampshire is one of the oldest states in the United States. This can be measured in many different ways. So in terms of the proportion over the age of 65, New Hampshire's seventh oldest. It has the second highest median age. That's partially because it has so many baby boomers in it. And it's growing. It's one of the fastest growing older populations in the United States. So by any measure, New Hampshire already has an older population, and it's going to continue to grow. So that's a factor that has to be addressed in policy and planning for the future. Now, diversity has lots of different measures. Age is one kind of diversity. There's also racial and ethnic diversity in the United States. This map shows the level of diversity in all the U.S. counties. There are 3,100 of them. The yellows and oranges are the most diverse places. They're the places where the likelihood, if you run into another person on the street, that they're going to be of a different race or Hispanic origin than you are. The greens and the blues are places where the population is less diverse. And you can certainly see that northern New England is not among the more diverse places in the United States. And yet, there is diversity within the state. This is New Hampshire's population in 2020 when we did the census. 12.8% of its population is minority. And by minority, I mean they're not white and non-Hispanic. So everybody who's Hispanic or is a race other than white represents about 13% of New Hampshire's population. But this differs significantly by age. So New Hampshire's adult population is about 11% minority. Its child population is over 20% minority. So within the state, diversity, racial diversity varies along the age structure. And this is true elsewhere in the United States as well. The most diverse part of the US population is the babies who were born last year. The least diverse part of the population is the oldest part of the population. That same story holds true in New Hampshire. And when we look at change in the population in New Hampshire, this shows you how different parts of the population are changing. So among children, the non-Hispanic white population has diminished, while the minority population of children has increased, not enough to offset the decline in the number of non-Hispanic white children. So the overall population of children in New Hampshire is declining. Among the adult population, the growth of the minority population roughly offsets the decline in the number of non-Hispanic whites in the working ages. Among the senior population, the older population, the white population gains are substantial. The minority population gains among the older population are very modest. So the overall trend is that there's an aging of the white population in New Hampshire, and that the minority population is younger and offsetting part, but not all, of the decline in the non-Hispanic white population. This also varies dramatically around the state. There are parts of the state which are actually fairly diverse, and other parts of the state that are hardly diverse at all. This is showing you what percentage of the population is diverse in 2020. Again, you can see the differences between the adult and the child population. So notice how much more diverse the child population is than is the adult population. And also notice the geographic variation. There are parts of New Hampshire which have quite diverse populations, and there are other parts of New Hampshire that aren't very diverse at all. This has all kinds of policy implications for any institution or agency that has to address variability. This is a close-up of the Manchester-Nashua core. You can see how diverse the total population, and particularly the child population, is in some parts of the Nashua border. So the colorful part near the top is Manchester, and the colorful part near the bottom is Nashua. Now let's take a real close-up. This is just Manchester. These are neighborhoods in Manchester. Look at the striking variability in the level of diversity in this area. So for agencies, school districts, medical centers that have to address or deal with a diverse population, the challenges that those kinds of agencies face in the Nashua Manchester area are quite different than what they would face in other parts of New Hampshire. So again, even in a modest-sized state like New Hampshire, there's remarkable variability along a lot of continuums: age, race, income, we're going to see in a minute, and poverty and diversity. Some areas, again, let's look at education. Here's education and income in New Hampshire. Again, the story here is that there's a lot of variability even within a small state like New Hampshire. Some areas have large concentrations of very well-educated people. Other areas have much less well-educated populations. This has implications for labor force. Same thing with income. There are parts of the state which have really quite high median incomes in their neighborhoods, and other parts of the state that are significantly poor. So the variability that we see in age and in race and Hispanic origin also is in education and income. This is poverty. New Hampshire, fortunately, has one of the lowest poverty rates in the United States. If not the lowest, then always one of the lowest poverty rates. But there is considerable variability in the amount of poverty, both in the population generally and in the young population within the state. So, I mean, the point I'm trying to make to you is that even in a small state like New Hampshire, there's a considerable amount of variability along a lot of gradients: population change, natural change, migration, race, education, income. And then you can see also here that there's quite a bit of variability within the racial groups along all these continuums. So the blue bar is showing you what percentage of the population over 25 has a college degree. The orange population is the average, or the orange color is the average. What proportion of the population is high income? And then the gray bar is what percentage of the population is in poverty. And you can see that there's variability in all of these things. So even in a state like New Hampshire, which stereotypically is portrayed as not very different from within itself, there's quite a bit of variability, and that has all kinds of policy and economic implications. Why do people move to New Hampshire? Why do they stay here? One important point I want you to understand also, a lot of focus is on migration in New Hampshire. How do we attract people? And that's important. But how do we retain the population we have as well is also an important issue. I've done a lot of research with my colleague Christine Bunchu about movement, why people come to New Hampshire, why people stay in New Hampshire. And here are the reasons that we've heard from people. The blue bar is recent migrants to New Hampshire who've come in the last 5 years. The orange bar is people who've been here for a long time. And you can see that there are a lot of factors that affect people's decision to stay here or to come here. Family is number one, the natural environment of the state, the beauty of the state. Number two, quality of life. Many people comment on how they like to live in smaller places and have more interaction with their neighbors. Employment, of course, is particularly important to people who moved to the state recently. Taxes, which are a big topic in New Hampshire, is a factor, but you can see they're further down the list. And then culture and lifestyle and in the economy are all factors. The other important thing we found is that people don't stay here or come here for only one reason. It's a combination of things that cause people to move to the state or to decide to stay here. So it's not one thing. You can see how economics, social place, physical place, family are all interconnected. So when you think about what can we do to retain people in New Hampshire, or how do we encourage people to come to New Hampshire, recognize that there are almost always multiple reasons for them to stay or to come. So just to summarize, population growth is slowing down long term, but in the short term, we've had a significant increase in population growth fueled entirely by migration. You could see that demographic change is uneven across the state. That diversity is growing. It's still mostly a non-Hispanic white state, but diversity is growing, especially among the young population. And then New Hampshire's population is aging very rapidly. It's already among the oldest states in the country, and it's aging rapidly as well. So what kind of implications does this have? Migration is important to New Hampshire's future. You could see it. It's an important source of human capital. It brings more young people to the state. It brings well-educated people to the state. But New Hampshire also needs to retain its existing population. There's a lot of talent and expertise here. We should do what we can to retain those people. No, I showed you that around 50,000 people a year move to New Hampshire, but 1.3 million people don't. So retaining those people is important as well because they're a significant pool of talent and skill. I'm not a policy expert. I'm a demographer. But again, people move to New Hampshire for multiple reasons, and any planning about how to retain or attract population needs to appreciate that. People need affordable housing, they need quality education, they need childcare, they need healthcare. Those are all things that will influence people's decisions about coming or staying. The natural environment of the state is important to people. We need to protect and preserve it. We need to make those areas accessible to lots of different kinds of people. We need to have policies that enhance the quality of life, since people said that's very important, to make all age groups and all kinds of people feel welcome in New Hampshire. And then we need policy that enhance employment opportunities in the state, like education, affordable education, internet access, ease of transportation. Last slide, Melinda. Remember that diversity remains modest, but it's growing. It's greatest among children, least among elders. So the timing of how different agencies or institutions are going to be affected by this will vary. Healthcare and education are facing challenges with this already. The labor force is going to need to address the growing diversity of the population too. And again, there are uneven patterns of growth and change in New Hampshire. Some communities are struggling to deal with rapid growth, new schools, more infrastructure. Other communities have to be able to deal with declining populations. Policy has to be designed that can be flexible about what kinds of communities we have. And finally, the aging of the population is a major concern. Rapid growth of senior populations certainly going to happen. Recent migrants aren't contributing most of this. This is mostly aging in place, and this will have implications as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. That was fantastic and insightful. Lots to talk about. So much data. Thank you. So I will encourage you all to go ahead and write your questions in the chat. We've already got some questions that we'll dive into. And I want to mention before we dive into the questions that we're going to make this recording available on the Carsey Policy Hour site, as well as some of Ken's policy briefs that really dive into some of this demographic data. So we're not going to include the slides. We're going to actually give you the full policy briefs that have infographics, but also explanations of these data. And so that will be available in the coming days. Okay, so I see a question here to get us started from our UNH colleague, Jason Seaman, who's the chair of UNH Recreation Management and Policy. Two questions. I'll start with the first. He's asking about college-bound youth. We seem to lose college-bound youth and retain non-college-bound youth. What incentives does this create to invest in higher education in New Hampshire? Any thoughts on that, Ken?
Well, I mean, I'm not an educational policy expert, so, but I have been struck by how New Hampshire does lose a significant share of its high school graduates to educational opportunities in other places. So, although I don't have any solution to the problem, it certainly is a relevant issue. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed. Sorry, I know that's dodging the question, but I'm just not an education policy.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. And so the second part of his question is, will the influx of higher educated immigrants be sufficient to achieve New Hampshire's workforce goals, or will New Hampshire need to change the dynamics around his first question concerning the college-bound students?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And again, I think it goes to this issue that I was trying to emphasize, that although all the attention is focused on migration, retaining our population in New Hampshire is also an important issue. And I think that it's one of those things that depends on a lot of different things. It's not just any one thing. It's having family nearby. It's liking the natural environment. So I think there's a lot of different things that need to be thought about in trying to address these issues of the future demand for the labor force. Certainly the influx of well-educated people helps New Hampshire be able to have a skilled and knowledgeable workforce. But if we can retain more of our young people, it would certainly heighten our advantage.
Yeah, so we have a question from Erin Sharp that is also education related, but she's also asking about the predictive quality of these data, because she mentions that when she first moved to the New Hampshire Seacoast back in 2009, all of the conversations in her local school district were about demographic loss and expectations of empty classrooms. But now the elementary schools are needing to expand. And so she's asking about the shift in migration. Has it been so dramatic that far outside of predictions? And I guess I want to piggyback on that and get your take on how well we can predict future trends with data like these.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue I deal with all the time. I'm not a big fan of prediction or of projection. I've seen too many bad projections. So I'm not, and I've seen too many changes in demographic trends, and you could see some of that just in the data we have. So I would not, I mean, if you asked me, is the older population of New Hampshire going to grow significantly in the future? I would say yes. Even for someone like me who doesn't want to do projections, those numbers are just staggering. For what's going to happen to the younger population, to the school-age population, that depends on so many things. It depends on fertility patterns. It depends on whether young adults of childbearing age decide to have children or how many children they're going to have. Certainly, I think it underscores the fact that we need to recognize in this state that there are going to be areas which are going to have demands for a growing population, where they're going to be having to deal with, should we build a new primary school? And there are going to be other parts of the state where there are going to be fights about merging school districts, which if you want to set communities on edge, just suggest you want to merge their school districts. So my point is just that we need to look at local demographic conditions and recognize that even in a state like New Hampshire, there's quite a bit of variability in what is going on across the state. So I'm sorry, I'm not willing to make projections.
Yeah, you really need to get into the nitty gritty and unpack that data to look at county by county, and then making projections is always tricky. So I get that. Thanks for that. Ken, this is my question. Was there anything in these data that really surprised you while you were crunching these numbers?
I was a little bit surprised at what happened during the COVID era, because I mean, we lost over 1.2 or 1.3 million people in the United States to COVID. So, and I knew all the New Hampshire counties, except for Hillsborough, were losing people. So I was a little bit taken aback at how much migration there was to New Hampshire during the COVID period. Now, the same trends were happening in other places. Recreational areas like Carroll County were receiving significant inflows of migrants. People were leaving urban cores, not everybody, but some people were leaving urban cores and going to the suburbs or beyond, which is to the advantage of New Hampshire. So I was a little taken aback at the amount of migration there was during such a difficult period, especially when during the Great Depression, people had stayed put. They hadn't moved. So yeah, I was surprised that New Hampshire got as much migration gain as it did.
Interesting. I myself am a Massachusetts resident, but I also considered a move up to New Hampshire during that period. So that's interesting. We have a question here from Sean Honing, asking about the births counted in the county of the hospital. Are the births counted in the county of the hospital or the residence of the parent?
Yeah,
He's noticed a concentration of births, with many hospitals no longer providing this service.
Yeah, that's a good point. And these births are counted in the county in which the mother resided. So okay, if the baby was born in another county, I mean, we actually have a challenge in New Hampshire because a significant number of babies in New Hampshire are born in Massachusetts, especially if there's any risk to the babies. And so it takes a while for the data to shift back, but these births are all place of residence of the mother.
A question going back to the issue of education from Andrew Coppins, who's the chair of the UNH Education Department. Are there other states in the country who have turned the corner and would be an example for New Hampshire in addressing these demographic issues, particularly around youth retention and growing education/workforce opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question too. Certainly, many of the southern states have received significant influxes of population. So that would be one possibility. But the other thing I would say is that there are many states who would give anything to have the migration profiles that New Hampshire does. I mean, New Hampshire is receiving significant inflows of people in their 30s and 40s and their children. I mean, there are many states that would give anything to have that happen to their state. Yes, New Hampshire has challenges retaining its young adult population, but it's done reasonably well even at that. So, you know, the southern states are the ones, most of them, who have received significant influxes of working age people. There's a lot of reasons why that is. It isn't any one reason. But so anyway, we're doing better than a lot of states. Let's just put it that way.
Fair enough. Another education-related question from Stacy Brown, wondering about the Carsey School specifically, if we're seeing these demographic changes reflected in our enrollment numbers. If so, which courses seem to be enrolling more students? Ken, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
I'm not sure I know enough about that. I know the enrollments are up this year compared to last year, but I don't know the intricacies of which classes they're being attracted to or anything like that.
Yeah, I'll simply say, as the graduate programs coordinator at Carsey, that we do have these professional master's programs, and we are leaning into the adult learner population at UNH and trying to think about workforce education and so on. So we're definitely seeing a steady period with our professional master's programs. At Carsey, we don't have any undergrad programs, so I can't speak to those. Question about Vermont and Maine, which also have large percentages of aging people and seniors. Do they also have similar patterns with their workforce and youth? In other words, are they facing similar challenges for the future? So thinking beyond New Hampshire to New England, especially Vermont and Maine. Do you have any thoughts about that, Ken?
Yes, I mean, New Hampshire is like Maine and Vermont in the sense that it has an older population. They're also have smaller child populations. Maine is sort of an interesting bifurcation because the Portland metro area is doing very well at attracting young adults. The rest of Maine has challenges. And in Vermont, similarly, Burlington does reasonably well, and other parts of the state are facing challenges. They also have recreational areas which are attracting amenity migrants to them. One of the interesting things about amenity migrants, especially related to policy and issues like that, is they bring a lot of expertise. Many amenity migrants have experience either in government or in corporations. So they bring a lot of expertise to small communities. If these small communities can figure out how to engage these amenity migrants, who after all have come because they love the area, it's a real advantage to the community. So it's an enormous sense of talent. I had somebody in the Lakes region tell me that they had a person who was a treasurer of a CFO of a huge corporation decide to be the treasurer of the city. He said, there's no way we could have had that kind of expertise. So, I mean, there's lots of different ways that talent can be tapped into for communities, and people should think creatively about that kind of thing.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Do we know where in the state a lot of these amenity migrants go?
Yes, we do. I mean, there are a set of counties in New Hampshire, but also in the other states, which during particularly during COVID, received huge influxes of people. I mean, where there were stories that houses were being bought before they even went onto the market. So it was a widespread phenomenon.
Great. Okay, so I think we are running out of time here. Any last closing thoughts, Ken?
No, I certainly appreciate people taking the time to talk to us and listen to us. And I hope that they recognize again that even in a small state like New Hampshire, there's a lot of variability and demographic change going on. And local communities need to recognize that, and policymakers need to know they need flexibility.
Thank you so much, Ken, for that incredibly insightful presentation. And thank you all for joining. Very quickly before we sign off, I want to let you know that our next Carsey Policy Hour is taking place on October 8th, 8 a.m. And we're going to learn about the One Big Bill Act passed by Congress over the summer. And our guest will be Deborah Fournier, who is the Director of Health Law and Policy at the Institute for Health Policy and Practice at UNH. She is going to discuss the provisions of the law and the implications of the new policies on taxes, health access, and food supports in particular. So that should be a riveting conversation. Please join us on October 8th. And I thank you all for joining us today. Until next time, take care.